Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the latest Data Barracks webinar. Just wait another 30 seconds, so no more than that, I promise. Just while a few more people join in. Delighted to see that we've had pretty much a record number of people register, showing that our webinars are becoming more and more popular, which we're obviously delighted with. So we'll just wait a couple more moments before I kick off, just to let a few more people join. Right. That's looking very good. So, like I said, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the latest in the Data Barracks series of how-to webinars, in which we're here to talk about how to run a tabletop exercise, and that's really to give you our top tips from many, many years of delivering crisis management, incident management, business continuity, and indeed disaster recovery exercises. My name's Chris Butler. I'm the Resilience Director here at Data Barracks, and I'm your host for the day. Today's focus is really on one of the most common forms of exercise, and it's something I'm sure that all of you are intimately involved with on a regular basis, and that is the tabletop business continuity exercise. If you've attended our webinars before, you'll know that we do like to keep things nice and tight. So my part will take about 30 minutes, I promise not to go over, and then we'll answer any questions that you might pop up. If you look in your screen, you should hopefully see a Q&A, a questions box. Do feel free, please, to pop any questions in there that you've got, and I'll get to those at the end. But to preempt the first question, yes, of course, we'll be sharing the slides with everyone who's registered for this afterwards, alongside a guide. So without further ado, let's get on with the presentation. So this is what we're going to cover today. We've got 4 areas. We're going to look at what is a tabletop exercise. We'll then give you some thoughts around how to plan an exercise, then look at the delivery of the exercise, and then finish up with some top tips for delivering a fantastic experience for those participants within your companies that you might be running this for. Before I get into the meat of that, though, I wanted to highlight some recent news from us here in Data Barracks. In May, only 2 months ago, we acquired a extremely well-respected business continuity and incident management consultancy that I'm sure many of you will have heard of, called Plan B Consulting. They're based up in Glasgow, and they've been around for almost as long as Data Barracks has. Extremely well-respected organisation, and only a few weeks ago they won the Business Continuity Consultancy of the Year award at the Continuity and Insurance Risk BC dinner, which is really fantastic news for them and all the hard work they've put in over the years for their services. Now, Plan B, like Data Barracks, is we like to think at the forefront of what we do, and amongst other things, they've actually written the book on business continuity exercising. So today we're reflecting on a lot of the content in that excellent book written by Plan B's founder, Charlie McLean Bristol, available at all good bookstores and indeed online Amazon. So what you've got here really is the best part of 20 years worth of shared experience and expertise to give you an overview of how to deliver a fantastic tabletop exercise for your teams. So really the first section, what I want to cover then is what exactly is a tabletop exercise, and there may be some of you on the call who haven't got that much experience of it. So you may be aware of this game. I suppose one of the best comparisons for a tabletop exercise would be to a role player game, a board game such as Dungeons and Dragons. You know, one of the original role-playing games, and actually still one of the most popular ones available these days. It surprised me quite how long this one has kept going. So in Dungeons and Dragons, you might be aware that players all have a character, and what they do is they work through adventures around a table guided by their dungeon master. Each player takes it in turns to respond and react to events as they unfold. Now, in a tabletop exercise, it's not that dissimilar. All the participants would have roles and responsibilities. Those are probably going to be related to your actual job rather than the game. But the adventure you're walking through is to respond to a business continuity disruption scenario, and you're led by a facilitator who sets the scene and guides you through the exercise. And it really is, it's a vehicle to explore in perhaps less stress than if you are in Dungeons and Dragons, the various decisions and actions that you'd have to take in the event that the scenario that you're dealing with hit you for real. And it also then allows you to review and consider your response processes, such as running the incident management meetings, or to run through how useful your plan checklists might be, or to review things like your communications guidelines. And we'll get into all of that as we go through this webinar. And ultimately, the aim of the tabletop exercise is to learn and improve, thereby becoming more resilient. So the other way to think about tabletop tests is to think about what they're for and where they sit in the mix of exercising and tests. And you can hear I've already used two terms there, exercising and tests. So let's start there. Tests, by and large, have a pass or fail result, and that applies just as much to your GCSEs as it does to the things that I'm talking about here. Exercises don't have a pass or fail component. So the example here would be that you conduct tests of IT recovery runbooks, or your facilities equipment. Does the generator start when you try to make it start? But you exercise your plans. So basically, where you've got a pass or fail scenario, you might talk about a test, but here today we're talking about exercising, because that's about the people and the procedures. So on this list here, you can see the types of exercise that you might have to deal with, to organize, or might be involved in. So we can start with the plan walkthrough, and that might be to talk through a newly developed or newly updated plan. And again, a plan talk-through can also be effective when people don't know much about the plan that you've got. And the way you'd run one of those would be for a facilitator or the business continuity manager would describe the plan, ask a few questions about the contents to raise awareness, and then the detail can be explored by those in the room or on the meeting to explore how the plan would work and what their roles might be. And you can use that also to check the content and the accuracy of the details in the plan. So that's a plan walkthrough. You can also have short exercises. Different ways of doing this. You can have a thing called a speed exercise, which might be 15 minutes to explore a specific point, or you can run a very simple tabletop exercise with a very basic scenario. And here I'm talking about an outside now type of exercise. And this is where, again, you might be combining a short exercise with some practical element. And the best example I can give you here is that we run this sort of exercise with clients in the education sector, where we might take the leadership team of a school and say, right, the alarm's gone off outside your evacuation points, pretend the building evacuation alarm has gone off, and then you're outside to decide and run through what next. And that's a really useful way of bringing things to life. You can also use short exercises for specific elements like running through the agenda or your communications or your stakeholders in a particular event. So basically, with a short exercise, you can be fairly inventive or creative to meet your needs. The next type of exercise might be a more formal incident management exercise, and this is designed more for command and control, practicing the behaviours of a leadership team in the event of a disruption. And this would involve a more formal approach to planning, such as involving an exercise director to lead the exercise and facilitators to run it, and I'll come on to those sorts of roles later on. And you normally combine incident management exercising with some training where you're looking through the plan in more detail, how to invoke it, practical use of the agenda, and practicing responses. You can then move up the scale to live exercises or full-scale incidents, and some aspects of these can be carried out in real time. So this is, again, more practical, and a good example might be an emergency team responding to a chemical spill if you're an industrial company, or similarly responding to a fire. This is where you've got people actually practicing the physical procedures that are needed, and that's how a live exercise would differ from other types of exercises. And live exercises are often used by government bodies for example, emergency planners or local resilience forums. And you can imagine that these scenarios would extend to nuclear, whether terrorism or a nuclear leakage from a plant, or hijacking or similar. So these are very much hands on the ground. You can also have a test. I've covered that, and that's the sort of the pass or fail, yes or no outcome. And then finally, you can then talk about a thing called a simulated exercise, which is another complex exercise that can involve a single team, it can involve multiple teams. But with simulated exercises, you're practicing through role play and real-time use of information delivered to the participants, the plans and the procedures in a more stressful way than you would with a planned walkthrough, or indeed the desktop that we're about to discuss in a bit more detail. So you very much got two-way communications. You need a stronger exercise delivery team, involving somebody to be in charge of it, the umpires, the observers, role players, perhaps people to play simulation from the media, and so on. So very much this is the top end of how you might run an exercise for an organization, and as you might imagine, requires a lot more planning and preparation. So those are some of the other types of exercise. If we now move on to the tabletop exercise, again, let's break these down into the types of tabletop exercise, which is what we're here to discuss this morning. There are these sort of four ways that you consider how you might get people around a desk, a table, to conduct the tabletop exercise. And the first one would be really treated as a discussion-based approach. So it's taking the plan walkthrough and moving that to the next level, where there's a bit more dynamism involved, but you are focusing on the scenario and what the team would need to do to respond to the scenario. And you can do that through either just raising a point verbally in the room or presenting a slide. But here, with this discussion-based approach, whoever's facilitating the exercise is posing questions of the audience, of the team, and you discuss what those responses might be. So you're not really testing the command and control element, you're discussing the responses. You can move this level to the upper stage to some form of semi-simulated exercise, where yes, again, you're presenting the information probably on screens with some additional visuals or social media and other and PR type of injects. But then the team gets a bit more free rein to respond to the incident as it's portrayed on the screens. So there's less discussion or coaching from the facilitator and more role play. But again, it's just around the room. It's where they're discussing what they might do together, and you're leaving the team a little bit more to get on with their responses. So you don't have any formal role players involved. It's still very much a tabletop exercise. The next level that you could move to would be a multi-agency or a team type of desktop. And again, I mentioned sort of the local governments, local resilience forums, emergency planners. This is something that perhaps they might use, where you'd be involving multi-agency response with different organizations represented in a room. So think about, local resilience forums responding to flooding or foot and mouth, where you've got blue light services and other agencies involved. Everyone's working on the same scenario, but the different participants on the different tables would be going through their responses in relative to their priorities for the same scenario. So different tables will be working on different aspects of the scenario, and then that's then fed back to the whole group, and that's a very powerful way of engaging different groups and different audiences. And then the final one on the screen is wargaming. Comes out of the military world, as you might imagine with that name. And you can actually you employ the technique of wargaming to a number of different types of exercise. But this is where you might have a team specifically playing the role of an adversary in the exercise, where they might respond to your actions. And a very good example of this would be in a cyber attack, where you might have a team playing the red team role in a cyber attack, where when you've responded to a scenario, they will then say, well, in this case, we would do the following, and you can then continue to play the exercise through, where there's got to be an element of response throughout the exercise. So that's quite an interesting way. Not so common, because it takes a bit more planning, but it's a very useful way of digging into some more complex problems. So if I sort of summarize the features then of a tabletop exercise, So a tabletop exercise is focused on the scenario. It's discussion based. It's designed to maximize learning. It's not really there to stress test command and control. There are other types of exercise that do that. It has a relatively limited variety and number of injects that are delivered in the room by facilitators. You don't really have designated role players, such as somebody playing a customer or the media. You can use a tabletop exercise to jump around in time, to explore different aspects of a scenario. It's certainly simpler to organize and deliver than some of the more complex live exercises or sim-exes, and it can be reused with different teams. So that's what a tabletop exercise is, and it's useful to have that distinction between the various different types in your mind. So how often then should you conduct an exercise? Well, it kind of depends who you ask. The professionals in the business continuity world will recommend twice a year as a minimum. The BCI's good practice guides suggest it's once a year. So we would agree that once a year is the absolute minimum, but it's useful to reinforce that with some training in between to make sure that people retain knowledge of plans and the procedures required to respond. And of course, the benefit of a tabletop exercise is that it is easier to organize than a full-scale event, as I just described. So therefore, you can include more in your schedule for the year, and you can use them for different purposes. And you can aim them at different levels. So one for your senior leadership team, one for your cyber and IT teams, and perhaps one with a facilities or a regional angle to it. So to finish off this first section, then, let's just sort of run through some principles that are useful to apply to the design of all exercises. And the first one is that scenarios shouldn't be too complex. Your participants have got to be able to understand what it is you're trying to do. They've got to understand the scenario and make sure that there's no excessive complexity that will divert people's attention away from your objectives for the exercise. You've got to make sure that the exercises are tailored to the level of the participants and the seniority. So make sure that it's appropriate if you're running an exercise for the senior team and at the executive level. Make sure the exercise is tailored to them. If it's one for the business units or for IT, make sure it's appropriate for their level of organizational risk and indeed their level of skills and experience. Wherever possible, you should make exercises based on real events and likely risks and feasible scenarios. That way, it'll feel as if it's been brought to life. And you've got to make sure that every exercise is designed so that people learn from them. You're not doing it for the sake of it. The outcome is to become more resilient and maximize learning for those participating. Which means you need to have clear objectives. And as part of your design phase, you should state what the exercise is trying to achieve and have agreed that with sponsors in advance. However, it shouldn't make it too simple. Like I said, not too complex, but equally not too simple. There should be some elements of surprise in there rather than it being very obvious what it is that's going to unfold. That way, it helps to stress test the procedures that you've got in front of the participants. It's got to appear real rather than it actually being real. So what I mean by this is when you're designing it, it's got to feel as if it could happen, even if some people might doubt it a little bit. But the appearance of realism is very important. And then the final principle is around debriefing. You should always conclude an exercise with a structured debrief so that you can capture any learning points. So that's what a tabletop exercise is. The next section is around planning the exercise and how to plan a good exercise. And what we recommend is you use this 4Ds model. And again, I referenced the exercise, the book earlier. There's a very good explanation of this in the book. But broadly, the 4 phases are to design, then develop, then deliver, and then finally to debrief. So in designing the exercise, that's where you're thinking about what it is you're trying to achieve, why you're trying to achieve it, and once you've got those objectives and the scenario in place, you can then move on to develop the exercise, the structure of it, the flow, the injects, your exercise instruction. You then deliver it using the appropriate techniques to the audience at hand, using whatever methods are necessary, and then finally as just mentioned in the principles, make sure that you conduct a debrief to run through how the exercise went for the participants. And we'll reflect on this as we go through the next part of this this webinar. And the first thing I want to talk about then is about designing your exercise and the scenario. And there's an important distinction to make here between designing exercise for the scenario or designing it for the impact. Because if you think about this in relation to your business continuity plans, you don't want your BCP to be solely scenario based, because that implies you will have a specific response for every type of incident that might happen. And the kinds of things you might happen might be, a rail disruption or a transportation outage or a supply chain or an electrical failure or an aviation accident or a cyber attack or extreme weather. There's lots of different scenarios, and I'm sure you've got some of those covered. But all of those types of scenarios have an impact, and they impact your ability to operate in different ways. And it's those impacts that you should be planning your exercises around, because what happens for real is unlikely to be specifically covered in a plan. So therefore, when you're writing your scenarios and designing what it is that you want to test, it's the impact that's important. And that will be a much smaller list of things that you can write into your scenario. So critical resources are unavailable from an IT outage scenario, or staff aren't able to work because they're sick from an infectious disease, and that could be your scenario. Or they can't get into the office, and that's a transportation scenario. Or there's the dreaded cyber attack. So plan for the impact, not for the scenarios, and design your exercise accordingly. One or two exceptions to that. It's obvious that you should have a scenario for a cyber attack. And if you live in an area where you've got a high risk of flooding, you should have a flood specific plan as well. But by and large, design your exercise for the impacts that are important to you. So who do you need? Well, you should break your participants down into two groups, and the first group that you need are your planners, your planning team. So you need somebody to lead the exercise. That could be titled the exercise director, if that's what you like. But it's basically somebody who's planning the engagement and setting out the scenario. They're our dungeon masters, if you like, if you remember my analogy from earlier. This can be somebody from within the business, but of course you can choose to bring in somebody from a third party to run it for you. You need somebody to look at the performance of the team. That you might call this an umpire or the facilitator or a coach. And this is somebody who remains apart from the delivery of the exercise and can take that sort of dispassionate view of what's going on in a room, and they can help to do the debrief as well. Then you need somebody to coordinate the exercise, and that's somebody who's managing the injects and steering the scenario along the lines that you've planned, making sure that the timelines of the exercise are met so that you're achieving your objectives. You might have some role players, depending on the style of the exercise. We talked earlier about what sorts of exercise you might have that in, but you might well have the role players that could cover the customer or the regulator or the chairman of the board. But then you can also have observers, and they can be either internal or external observers, depending on the circumstances. On one exercise that I ran, we had observers from the group head office come in to observe both the delivery of the exercise on our part, but also the performance of the participants. Which takes me to the second bunch, which is the participants. Clearly, you need to know who's the leader of your team, who'll be the one in the hot seat is basically what we're talking about here, and this should come out your plan, of course. Then you've got the rest of those attending from the plan that you've got, the rest of the incident management team, the crisis management team, or whoever it is. You could have a range of suppliers and third parties involved, and we do recommend you try and involve them, especially your critical third parties. An example would be if you're running a disaster recovery test, then that's what Data Barracks does. So you can bring us into your exercise. But it's useful to do that because then you're helping to the partnership is important, and you're helping to understand how your critical third parties would work in line with your plan. And that could, of course, include some of your critical services, your important IT providers. You absolutely need somebody to take notes and document what you're doing. And then you've got the range of other participants that you might need to use. But another point to bring out here is don't always exercise the same people. There's no use having the same bunch of people who are incredibly well drilled, but lots of folk in the business who don't really know how the plan works. Make sure you include deputies. So now moving on to the what do you need, having just covered the who do you need. So you really need to start with the purpose and the objective. So really ask yourself, why are you conducting this exercise? And that will give you the scope and the scenario. So is this one department? Is it a location? Is it a whole company? Is it the C-suite? Is it the business continuity team? So then you need a location, usually some form of large meeting room, but actually increasingly such exercises are held online. And there's a top tip here. Microsoft Teams breakout rooms are extremely useful for an online exercise, but you do need to work out how to use them in advance. Now we call here the battle box as the next thing you need. And basically this is your plans plus anything else you might need as part of invoking the plan. And a good example might be authorization codes for invoking certain elements of the plan, or having the tokens for use for online banking if you're having to do that in a different way. And this might also include contact lists and inventories and so on. It'll also include your plans to account for the fact that you might not be able to access the plans online, and you will want the participants to be able to access these plans themselves. They need to refer to them in the exercise. Then they might not be following them slavishly, but you have a plan for a purpose, and it needs to be part of the exercise. And then the last thing you need is enough time to be able to work through your scenario and time for review as well. So do make sure you've got enough time blocked out in everyone's diaries for all of that. And 2 to 3 hours is the kind of time that you should be planning as an average for such exercises. So why are you doing this exercise then? So what are you looking to achieve? When we talk about objectives, what do the objectives lend themselves well to a particular scenario? Are you looking to develop people skills? Are you looking to test communications? Are you looking to test a particular single point of failure that you've got within the business? So when you're designing your exercise, you've got to be very rigorous about going back to comparing the design of the exercise to the objectives that you set out in the first place. The next thing is, do you have the right level of complexity? And here's a way to think about this. Goldilocks bowls of porridge, where neither too hot nor too cold. You want it just right. It can't be too simple, but also it can't be too complex, as we mentioned earlier. But within that, you need to understand what technical details you might require in order to make the scenario work to meet the objectives. Having mentioned communications a couple of times, to what extent do you want media and social media involved? Is that going to be a key part of your objectives? And if so, then you need to be designing the scenario in such a way that it would be a natural consequence to have media interest. Another element to think through is whether you're testing the process of response, or are you learning about the scenario and its impacts? This is slightly different to what I mentioned earlier, but sometimes an exercise can be designed purely to walk through the procedures rather than to learn more about the scenario itself. And you've got to be clear in understanding what that is that you're trying to achieve. Here's a good question as well. Do you need to win? Do you want everyone to walk away from the exercise feeling that they've solved the problem? In other words, is there a route to solution, or are there other objectives at play? So you're getting towards a solution, but you may not actually have won it. And the final point is there something in the scenario for everyone in the audience? Because sometimes you might find that there are participants in the room who've got nothing to do. And make sure when you're designing your exercise that you've done this, that you've included elements for everyone in the room. Now, you can't make that equal across the board, but look who's on the team and think about how you might engage with each of them. And that requires a little bit of thought when going through the design and the planning phase. So there's certain things you need to get right when you're planning and understanding why you're delivering and designing and delivering the exercise. So having talked about the planning, now we're going to move on to the third section, which is around delivery. And what does an exercise actually look like? Well, funny old thing, an exercise has got a start, a middle, and an end. Oops, apologies. So what does an exercise actually look like? Well, you'll come into a room, you need a facilitator, and they will start off by introducing, setting the scene, and telling you what is required. So that'll involve introductions, and we recommend in that circumstance you going around the room and seeing what experience there is, and especially if this is a team that you may not be familiar with, what experience is there in the room of disruptions in the past, and you can use that, especially if you're a facilitator, as you go through the tabletop. Make clear what to expect so that people know what's coming, and set out some ground rules for the engagement as well. The exercise will then work through the procedures, whatever those procedures are, whether they're incident management or crisis management or whatever. You're using the plans, and the tabletop is designed to walk through the plans using data or scenario injects, which are provided in the forms that you've planned, and you might have a sort of a master events list that you're running through the scenario with. But the point is to provide the data, the scenario in injects, which allow people to walk through the plans. And then you're going to be able to adapt throughout the session that you've got, and depending on the style of the exercise, you'll be doing things slightly differently throughout, but you've got to be fairly adaptive to the way in which the scenario and the plan is unfolding in the room, because you're there to make sure that they're achieving their learning objectives. And then finally, of course, this is what it looks like. So you've gone through the plan, but then you've got to review it at the end and go through the hot debrief. And I'll talk a bit more about debriefs shortly, but you must plan in a hot debrief at the end of the exercise. So on the day the exercise looks like that, but then of course after the exercise you've got to follow up the outcomes. So what is your plan to follow up? What's been identified? What actions have been agreed? What are the priorities? Some of those will come out the hot debrief. You've then got, after the exercise, to write and share a review of the exercise, a post-exercise report. Somebody's got to carry out the actions, which means you've got to agree the ownership. And if this is internal, then that might be slightly easier. If you're an external, then you've got to gain that clarity as to who's carrying out those actions. Send the report around those who are there and any other stakeholders, and then think about what your next exercise might be. So that's what the engagement might look like on the day and in follow-up. Let's now think in a little bit more detail about actually running the exercise and what a facilitator should be thinking about when managing the exercise. So, really, there's a sort of a flow here to running the exercise, and it's important that that you follow the plan. You should, in your planning phase, have completed a timeline so you understand what inject of scenario information needs to come in when, and what are you expecting to see from the room. So what's the anticipated result or response or observation that you might have for the team in the room, for the participants. And it's useful here to have some form of common format to be able to make certain observations as to how things are going in the room and the performance of the participants, because you need to provide that post-exercise report afterwards. And if you've got a number of observers there, you should have a common format that they can use as well. So you want to be sticking to the timings, following the plan, keeping the flow of the exercise going, because you want them to make progress, and don't allow people to get too stuck down in the weeds. But there's a balance there. You've got to make sure that they're able to use the response documentation. You've got to be able to ensure that they're communicating well. Was there some clarity to the decisions and actions that were that emerged from the response? But you've also got to keep them going on the timeline, because you are limited in your overall time to the 2 or 3 hours that you might have set aside. But you've then got to be able to react to what's going on in the room, and if that requires you to take a different approach to providing the injects of information back into the role players, into the participants, then that's what you need to do. And that's the skill as the facilitator or the coordinator of the exercise, is to make sure that happens. So you're not rigidly sticking to the script, because that can also then upset the flow of the exercise. This maintaining the flow really is an important part of generating a really good exercise that participants will feel have gone well. And the maintaining the flow and being flexible and reacting to the decisions of the participants is a skill that comes with a bit more experience as a facilitator. On the making notes point, the observations and the feedback will form a core part of your post exercise report, and because it's fundamentally a learning opportunity, that report is really important. We can't stress enough the approach of the hot debrief and the providing of the feedback and the report that follows on, because this is how improvements will be made in the organization. But then you've also got to end the exercise at some point and try and end at a natural point that allows for a wrap up. And this is where the flexibility comes in, and reading the room. Before you call index, try and help them wrap up some outstanding issues or actions, and then still leave yourself enough time to start the debrief, and get to the end of the engagement. You might have to truncate a few things or speed up some other areas, but you want to try and get to a natural point before you end the exercise, and that way those in the room will have had a good experience. So then finally, I mentioned the debriefing and evaluation and stressed a couple of times how important this is. There's two different styles. There's the hot debrief and the cold debrief, and they really are essential to review what went on, review the discussion, and then critically allow the participants the opportunity to feedback on their roles, their processes, and the plan. So the hot debrief is done immediately. As the exercise finishes, you should allow 20 or 30 minutes for that ideally, and involves everyone who's involved, the participants, the facilitators, the observers, and indeed any role players if you've had them. It's useful to then have feedback forms. Get that, again, the hot take. You can do that online through a Microsoft Forms or a piece of paper. Don't let people leave the room without filling in some feedback. That's really important. If you wait for it for later on, you probably won't get it. And then making your observations, you should be thinking about two areas: the what went well and the areas for improvement. And more often than not, participants will focus on the areas for improvement and where they thought it went wrong. Actually, you want to encourage them to make some positive comments as well, because there will always be some things that were positive and some things that give you opportunities to improve, and make sure that you pull out both of those from your hot debrief. And then once you've done a hot debrief, then you can move to a cold debrief sometime after event, and this might be with a smaller selection of participants from the event rather than everyone who participated in the exercise. But you get the core people together to more fully reflect on what happened in the exercise, and allow the benefit of hindsight to look back and pick out any extra points. But an agenda is useful for that, and you can therefore conduct a structured debrief or an after action review, which are both really good ways of conducting giving you a framework to be able to conduct that cold debrief. So yeah, it's important to do both, and that also contributes clearly to your post exercise report. So final section then, before we wrap up and look for questions, is some tips for a fantastic exercise. So what are the key things to think through to make a great exercise? I think you've got to challenge assumptions is one thing. It's easy to say, or to allow participants to say, well, I would do this, or our supplier would have spares, or that server would recover in 30 minutes. Actually, you want to be challenging and checking some of that. For example, if your supplier has spares, what happens if they actually don't? What's your plan B for that? So challenge assumptions as you're going through, because that's an opportunity to really dig into your plan and whether it would work for real. So that's an important part. You also need to sort of think about the scenario and making sure that participants aren't overly fighting the scenario, or indeed arguing over who might be responsible, who's at fault for a particular aspect of it. So you can address some of this in the design of the scenario, but actually you can set the condition for that right at the start, and you can say, look, we know this is going to be severe, we know it's going to be extreme, but it is plausible. And in particular, if you're talking about things like a cyber attack, all the advice is assume it will happen. So you are by nature generating something that's going to be a worst case scenario, a severe scenario. And in my experience these days, people are less inclined to fight the scenario and will always try and avoid arguments, but it might happen. But you've just got to try and steer your way through that. And it's useful to set that out right at the start so that nobody's feeling criticized or under the spotlight. But then you also try and, to a really good exercise, make it real. Again, this depends on the type of the exercise, but a desktop exercise could still be brought to life with some media simulation, because that's going to be a real aspect of any response. Try and think of ways of making it slightly unexpected. So there's that element of surprise that I referred to earlier, and also make it memorable. And you can try and bring along an element of fun to it as well, so that it really does stand out and it isn't seen as sort of just another boring tick box exercise. So those are three, the making it real, making it unexpected, and making it memorable will really help to sort of embed some of the learning as well. And then very finally, before we move on to sort of the questions, so these are the sort of the key takeaways. Oh, sorry, it hasn't come through yet. Sorry, my apologies. I forgot that there's the quote there. Regina Phelps is a very well-known American business continuity lead and expert, and it's an important point actually that she's made. And here's the quote from it, which is, exercises themselves can feel stressful as well, but they're there for a learning experience. So actually, there's nothing wrong in making mistakes when you're going through an exercise. And I suppose there's another key point to stress to those who are participating. You're there to learn. It's not a real event. So if you're making mistakes, that's fine. It's not an opportunity for everyone in the organization to learn from it. So now I can move on to the "if you remember nothing else" slide, which is this. So when you do an exercise well, it really helps to grow engagement across the organization, and will make your role as the BC manager or the exercise facilitator or somebody with that responsibility easier, because those who are there will think that was really worth my time. So I'm happy to spend more of my time on this resilience. In order to do that, but you've got to be really structured, and therefore the 4Ds approach of design, develop, deliver, and debrief is a very good structure that you have, because it means that it feels like you know what you're doing. You've definitely got to go beyond a tick box approach, uh, because if you're just doing it once a year to satisfy a regulatory requirement, you're not actually going to be any more resilient than that would sound. And then finally, you're there to learn. So encourage the participants to make mistakes and to explore the limits of what they've got in their plans in front of them. So those are the top tips. We do have some resources as usual. You've got our website. There's some links on there, which you'll see when we come through. I've included a link to the knowledge zone of our Plan B team. They've got some great resources on there as well for you to go through. As I say, you can find those connections, those resources when you get when we share the slides with you after this event. I'm now going to move on to any questions. Are there any questions that anyone's got? Do still please throw them into the chat group, and I will get to those now. Just give me a minute to get into that particular pane. So here's a question: have you made any advancements with the way you run exercise to utilize AI injects? It's an interesting question, and there's a lot of debate and discussion around AI generally and where it's going to go. I think certainly one thing I have done with AI is actually use the AI to generate imagery for elements of a scenario, so you're not having to go into stock images, and AI will produce an image that represents, for example, in a recent tabletop exercise that we ran as a big event, external event, to generate, for example, queues inside an airport terminal of angry passengers trying to get away. So you certainly can use AI for things like image generation. Beyond that, I think the ability of AI to create you scripts is something that can be explored as well. But that's something I still think is probably a little bit of a work in progress for many companies. Next question: would you recommend companies have a dedicated BC manager, or can it fall to a quality or a risk function? So I think that again, another interesting question. A lot of that will depend on a number of factors, one of which will be the size of the organization and to what extent it may be have to have regulatory interest in it. So if you're a regulated organization in the financial services sector, you're much more likely to have a dedicated BC manager. Of the two, say, just compare the quality or risk, both of those should be involved in the function of business continuity. I would say that risk is probably closer to the BC world, but quality is very much still aligned. My personal recommendation was to have somebody who is focused on business continuity. If your organizational structure can allow it. Historically, BC sat in the IT sphere, and more recently, the last sort of 5 to 10 years, it's definitely it's come out into its own grouping, if you like. I would certainly recommend that wherever possible, you do have a dedicated business continuity manager who works very closely with quality and risk, and sits somewhere central within the organization. Next question. Can you comment on the fun comment you made? More fun will get better participation and more memorable, but it downplays the pressure and realism. What's the advice on how much? I think I would certainly come straight back to what your objectives are for the exercise, and are you looking to expand knowledge on a particular topic, or are you looking to stress test procedures and skills around command and control? I think fun it should be also seen as engaging, and to the extent where the participants will walk away thinking that they've benefited from it, that they've learned something from it, and they've enjoyed the engagement that they've had. Obviously, it's not we're not talking about making something or designing an exercise that it's not really generating laughs out of the scenario, but it's trying to make people fully engage with the process. I suppose the corollary is if you make something too boring, you lose engagement. So it is a balance. Take it back to your objectives, focus on what those are, design a scenario, and understand what you're trying to achieve. Next question. What industry fields do you get the most buy-in from for exercises? It can be difficult to get the required engagement from industries that don't see the obvious threat to their business. And what's the best way to illustrate the benefits of exercises and drills? Yeah, no, that's a great challenge. So one of the things that we do for some of our customers is to help them through providing a risk landscape briefing or workshop, including horizon scanning. And for that, you can then focus the risk landscape or horizon scanning on the particular sector. And by that, I mean you're then demonstrating where peer organizations have suffered similar outages. And if you can then demonstrate the impact of those outages, that would hopefully start to make people pay more attention. My experience is that actually, by and large, engagement is easier to gain nowadays. Especially from more senior teams, and especially around the cyber world. The industry field that we get most buy-in from would certainly be around regulated industry. So that would include obviously all the financial services sector, the insurance sector as well, but also the legal sector, who aren't necessarily tied to operational resilience. But anything where there's regulation, and you can add the EU's DORA regulation to that, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which many even UK-based companies are reviewing, that has got a requirement to demonstrate exercising in it. And you could then move into the areas of critical national infrastructure. They also are coming under the scope of the enhanced Network and Information Systems Directive, which again is aligned to DORA a little bit. So the fields where you get the most buy-in are those where there's already a requirement to be able to demonstrate resilience through regulation, but also where there might be a heightened number of attacks in that industry with a significant impact on those companies, and you can use those case studies to get buy-in. Small workshops that focus on going through a particular aspect of a scenario can also help to get that engagement, because it starts to bring the issue to life for people. So yeah, the name of the book, it was let me what I can do is I can flash back up to that book and show you. It's the Business Continuity Exercises, Quick Exercises to Validate Your Plan, written by Charlie McLean Bristol, who was the founder of Plan B, who now are part of our team. So there we go for the person who wanted that room. next that book, sorry, is there a template of key generic scenarios that all organizations should consider? I mean, yes, you know, fire, floods, extreme weather, cyber is the obvious one, but you know, I really would like you to come back and think on the impacts and what are the worst case scenarios that would deliver the worst impacts to your business, and then take your scenario from that. The two examples I gave were cyber and flooding if you live in a floodplain. I think those ones would be fairly clear from something like your risk register, but I'd urge you to think about it from the impacts point of view. What would be the worst case scenario? What sort of disruptions to the business would affect you the worst, and what scenarios would then give rise to those disruptions? I think that's where I would start. But yes, you can the other place you can start for your is to think on your industry, and then go to, you know, Mr. Google and look for recent case studies of disruptions or crises that hit similar companies to your company, and then you can start there. Look at a case study. So if you're a public sector, you could look at a government disruption, or a disruption to you know, a council, or if you're in education, look at universities or industrial. There's plenty there as well. So there's sectoral based scenarios as too. And then the final question is, any comments on the NCC exercise in the box? Do you recommend it? Yes, use it. It's the NCC, just generally a point on the National Cybersecurity Centre. They're fantastic. They've got some really good resources, and the exercise in the box gives you a number of different ways to start to develop your understanding of how to exercise a cyber scenario. And they've got different levels of complexity, different durations. I think everything that the NCSC provides to all businesses is fantastic, and I would certainly recommend it. Their focus is largely on the sort of the bigger, you know, systemic organizations or the critical national infrastructure, but they actually will help pretty much most companies, and what they can do is really good. And actually that allows me to finish by reflecting on another type of exercise, which again we can provide through our Plan B team. They're one of the first 8 companies to be certified by the National Cybersecurity Centre to provide cyber incident exercising. So, you know, it's a really good way, as for the biggest threat that's out there is cyber for most companies. And you know, you can start with the exercise in the box from the NCSC, but you can then grow and expand out for that and get more into more demanding types of scenarios. So that's all of the questions that have come up. Some great questions there. Thank you very much for those. I don't see any more exercises coming in. Any more exercises coming in. Any more questions coming in? We've now comfortably gone over the sort of the 30 minutes of the scenario and 20 minutes of questions. So I'd like to thank you all for attending. And you know, if anyone wants any more follow-up, you know where to find us. We are always here to discuss anything to do with the business resilience with anyone. And so thanks for your engagement, thanks for attendance, and we look forward to seeing you all on our next webinar.